The coldest thing about losing everything is realizing how invisible you become until a frightened child looks at you like you still matter. The rain had been falling for hours when I saw her standing beneath the flickering light of a downtown bus stop, small enough to disappear into the shadows if someone wasn't looking closely. I was 68 years old, soaked through a secondhand raincoat, and carrying everything I still owned inside a faded canvas tote bag that smelled faintly of detergent from a church laundry room. Seattle storms had a way of settling into your bones, especially when you had nowhere to go. My shoes were wet. My hands shook from the cold. And inside my coat pocket sat the last $10 I had in the world, folded carefully beside a bus receipt from 3 days earlier. I had planned to spend it on coffee and soup at a diner near the shelter before they closed for the night. That $10 was supposed to carry me through until breakfast. Then I noticed the girl. She couldn't have been older than 10. Blonde hair plastered to her forehead from the rain, pink sneakers splashed with mud, a navy coat far too expensive for a child standing alone in weather like this. She kept glancing toward the dark street, then down at the sidewalk as if trying very hard not to cry. Something about the way she stood made my chest ache. Too stiff, too quiet. Children weren't supposed to look that worried. I stepped closer, careful not to startle her. "Sweetheart," I said softly, my voice rough from cold air and too little sleep. "Are you okay?" She looked up fast, blue eyes wide with fear and suspicion all tangled together. For a second, I saw something familiar there. Loneliness. "I can't find my dad," she whispered. Her lower lip trembled before she pressed it still again, like she'd already decided crying wouldn't help. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. Cars hissed through puddles nearby. The city felt too loud around someone so small. "What's your name?" I asked. "Emily," she said quietly. She hugged herself tighter and looked down at her shoes. "Dad always says not to trust strangers." I almost smiled at that. "Your dad sounds smart." She hesitated before adding, "He also says people only help when they want something." The words landed heavier than she probably intended. I glanced toward the diner across the street, warm lights glowing through fogged windows. My stomach tightened at the thought of losing the only meal I could afford. Then I looked back at Emily standing there shivering in the rain. Some decisions happen quietly. No drama. No speeches. Just something inside you refusing to become hard. "Then maybe," I said gently, holding out my hand toward the diner entrance, "your dad just hasn't met the right people yet." 20 minutes later, Emily sat across from me in a cracked vinyl booth with steam rising from a bowl of chicken noodle soup, while I slid my last $10 bill across the counter to pay for dinner, not knowing I had just changed the direction of my life. Emily ate slowly, carefully, like someone trying not to take too much space in the world. Every few minutes, she glanced toward the diner window where rain streaked across the glass in crooked silver lines. The storm outside had turned the city blurry, soft around the edges, but inside the diner, everything felt warm in a way I had almost forgotten existed. The hum of old refrigerators behind the counter, coffee brewing somewhere nearby, the quiet clink of dishes, ordinary sounds, the kind people stop noticing when life still feels stable. I wrapped my hands around a paper cup of hot water the waitress had given me for free after noticing my soaked coat. The warmth barely touched the ache in my fingers, but I held on to it anyway. Emily pushed her spoon through the soup and finally looked at me. "Are you cold?" she asked. Children had a strange way of asking honest questions adults spent years avoiding. I smiled faintly. "A little." She frowned as though that answer bothered her more than it should. "My dad says people should not be cold if someone can help." I looked away for a second. Funny thing about losing everything. At first people tell you it will only be temporary. A rough season. A misunderstanding. Then the weeks stretch into months, and suddenly strangers stop looking at your face. They notice the tired coat. The worn shoes. The bag you carry too tightly. I had learned to become smaller. Quieter. Easier to ignore. "Your dad sounds like he cares about people," I said gently. Emily hesitated. "He tries." She lowered her voice. "But he works all the time." Her spoon stopped moving again. "He was supposed to pick me up after piano lessons. I got scared when he did not come." I nodded slowly. Fear looked different on children. Less hidden. Less practiced. Mine had learned silence years ago. There had been another kitchen once. A warm one. A house outside Tacoma with cedar trees lining the driveway and chipped flower pots I never remembered to replace. My husband Thomas used to complain every winter that I kept the thermostat too low while secretly adding blankets to my chair before I woke up. After he passed, the quiet inside that house changed shape. Daniel said he wanted to help me. Heather smiled too much and talked about simplifying life and financial planning. At first it sounded loving, helpful even. Then came signatures, meetings, boxes packed too quickly, words spoken gently enough to sound reasonable while leaving bruises you could not point to. Temporary, Daniel had promised. Just until things settled down, Mom. I stared at the steam rising from Emily's soup. Temporary had become sleeping in shelters when there was space and bus stations when there was not. Temporary became counting quarters, skipping meals, pretending pride tasted enough like dinner. Emily suddenly slid half her grilled cheese sandwich toward me across the table. You should eat too, she said quietly. I almost said no. Habit, maybe. Pride too. But the look on her face stopped me. Small hands. Serious eyes. Kindness offered without calculation. I swallowed hard and broke off a piece. Outside, thunder rolled again, low and distant, while somewhere beyond the rain I noticed headlights slowing near the diner entrance. The headlights lingered outside longer than they should have, blurred behind rain and fogged glass until they disappeared again into the storm like someone uncertain they had found the right place. Emily turned toward the window so quickly that her spoon clattered softly against the bowl. Hope flashed across her face and vanished just as fast. Maybe it is him, she whispered, though she sounded like she was trying to convince herself more than me. We waited another minute. Nothing happened. No one walked through the diner door. No familiar voice called her name. The disappointment settled quietly across her small shoulders. She looked down at the untouched half of her sandwich and pressed her lips together. He is usually not late, she said after a while. He forgets things sometimes, but not me. Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten. Children remembered every promise adults thought they had only been a little. Outside, the storm pressed harder against the city. Wind rattled the diner windows. Somewhere near the kitchen, dishes clinked softly while old country music played low through speakers that crackled with static. Time slowed down in places like that. The kind of place where lonely people sat longer than necessary because warmth felt expensive. Emily yawned suddenly and looked embarrassed by it. You must be tired, I said gently. She shook her head, even while blinking too slowly. I am okay. 5 minutes later, her chin nearly touched the table. I smiled despite myself. Come on, I said softly, sliding out of the booth. You can sit beside me until we figure things out. She hesitated before gathering her coat and moving carefully into the booth next to mine. She smelled faintly of rainwater and strawberries, the kind of shampoo children probably forgot they even used. For a while we sat quietly together, watching the storm move through the parking lot like something alive. Her small fingers twisted nervously in the sleeve of her coat. Do you have kids? She asked suddenly. The question arrived gently, but it landed somewhere heavy. I looked down into my paper cup. Empty now? I have a son, I said carefully. His name is Daniel. She tilted her head. Does he help you? Children had a way of asking questions adults spent years dancing around. I stared at the wet parking lot outside and searched for an answer that did not feel ugly. Sometimes people become different when life changes, I said at last. Sometimes they forget things they should remember. Emily frowned at that like she did not think forgetting was a very good excuse. That sounds lonely. I let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Sometimes it is. She grew quiet again, studying me with the kind of serious attention only children seemed able to give. Then, without warning, she leaned lightly against my arm. Just enough to feel less alone. Not heavy, not demanding. Trust offered in the smallest possible way. I stayed still, afraid movement might scare it away. Outside, another black vehicle slowed near the diner entrance, this time followed by headlights behind it, brighter than before, lingering long enough to make even the waitress glance toward the door. The diner door opened so suddenly that cold air swept across the room and made everyone glance up at once. Rain followed in with it, sharp and silver beneath the neon sign outside. 2 men stepped in first, both wearing dark coats damp from the storm, their eyes moving quickly across the room in the careful way people searched when something precious had gone missing. Neither looked angry, only tense. Concern sat visibly on their faces. Behind them came a tall man who stopped just inside the entrance as though the world had tilted beneath him. His dark coat hung open, rain still clinging to his shoulders, and exhaustion showed plainly in the tightness around his eyes. He looked like someone who had not taken a full breath in hours. Then Emily stood so quickly the booth rattled softly against the floor. "Dad," she whispered. Not loud, not dramatic, just relief breaking quietly through fear. The man crossed the diner faster than dignity probably allowed, kneeling beside her chair without hesitation. "Emily," he breathed, his voice unsteady in a way that surprised me. He reached for her shoulders, checking her face carefully like he needed proof she was truly there. "I have been looking everywhere for you." Emily threw her arms around his neck and held on tightly. "I got scared," she admitted softly. "My phone died, and the storm got bad." He closed his eyes for half a second and simply nodded against her hair. I know. Relief. Looked strange on adults. Messier than children expected. One of the men near the entrance quietly stepped back toward the door, speaking softly into an earpiece while the waitress exchanged a glance with the cook behind the counter. The room had gone quieter without anyone meaning for it to. Then Emily pulled back and pointed toward me. She helped me. The man turned toward me for the first time. Really looked at me. Not through me. Not past me. At me. His eyes moved briefly over my worn coat, the canvas bag near my feet, the empty paper cup on the table, then settled somewhere gentler. "You stayed with her?" he asked quietly. I nodded once. She should not have been alone in weather like this. He swallowed hard, as though something inside him shifted unexpectedly. Most people would have called someone and left. I glanced toward Emily, who still held the edge of my sleeve without realizing it. She looked frightened. I said simply, "No child should sit alone in a storm." Emily frowned suddenly. "She bought me soup," she announced, "and grilled cheese." Her voice softened. "She gave me the last money she had." Silence landed heavier than thunder. The man looked at me again, slower this time, as though seeing something he had missed. His expression changed in a way I could not quite name. Respect, maybe. Sadness, too. "My name is William Parker," he said carefully after a moment. "And I think I owe you more than I can explain." I shook my head lightly. "You do not owe me anything." Emily reached for my hand before either of us said another word and held it tight, like she was suddenly afraid somebody might ask her to let go. William stood there for a moment as though he had forgotten where he was. The storm outside still rattled the diner windows. Dishes still clinked quietly somewhere near the kitchen, yet something in the room had shifted. Emily kept one hand wrapped around mine, while leaning lightly against her father, unwilling to fully let go of either of us. William glanced at the waitress, then toward one of the men near the entrance who nodded once before quietly stepping outside again. "Please," William said carefully, pulling a leather wallet from inside his coat. "At least let me repay what you spent tonight." He spoke politely, but there was urgency beneath the words, the kind people carried when gratitude felt too large to sit quietly inside them. He placed several crisp bills onto the edge of the table, more money than I had seen together in months. I looked at it for only a second before gently sliding it back toward him. "No," I said softly. His eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised. "You do not have to refuse out of politeness," he said. Emily told me what happened. I folded my hands together near the empty cup and gave a small shake of my head. I did not help her because I expected anything in return. Silence stretched for a second. Not awkward, just thoughtful. Emily looked between us carefully. "She really means that," she said quietly. She almost did not eat because she bought food for me. William looked down at the untouched coffee sitting near my side of the booth, then at my coat hanging damp beside me. Something unreadable crossed his face. Concern, maybe, or guilt for a world he suddenly seemed aware of in a new way. "At least let me drive you somewhere warm tonight," he said after a moment, gentler now. "A hotel. Somewhere safe." I almost smiled at the word safe. Funny how people imagined safety looked permanent once money entered the conversation. "That is kind," I answered, "but I have somewhere to go." It was only partly true. The overnight shelter near Pine Street still had a few open cots if you arrived before midnight. He noticed the hesitation anyway. Some people were observant because business trained them to be. Others noticed because life humbled them enough to pay attention. I could not tell which kind William Parker was yet. Emily suddenly tugged my sleeve. "Can she come with us?" she asked, hopeful enough to hurt. "Just for tonight?" William looked startled by the question, but did not dismiss it. He looked at me instead. Really looked. past the raincoat, past the tired face and worn shoes. Like he was trying to understand how someone old enough to remind him of home ended up sitting alone in a diner counting dollars during a storm. "You should not be alone tonight," he said quietly. "No pressure. Just dinner, warmth, a place to rest." I glanced toward the window where rain still blurred the city lights into soft streaks. Somewhere out there waited cold sidewalks, hard shelter beds, and another night pretending exhaustion counted as sleep. Emily squeezed my hand tighter. Small fingers. Quiet trust. Something inside me shifted before I could stop it. Not hope exactly. I had learned to be careful with hope, but maybe something close to remembering what kindness felt like when it arrived unexpectedly. I did not answer right away. Age teaches you something painful about kindness. Sometimes it arrives carrying strings you cannot see until much later. I had trusted gentle voices before. Trusted promises wrapped in concern. Daniel used to stand in my kitchen with his hands in his pockets, smiling softly while saying things like, "We just want to make things easier for you, Mom." Heather would nod beside him, offering tea, speaking carefully about fresh starts and reducing stress after Thomas passed. Small words, caring words. Until one day my name no longer belonged on documents I barely remembered signing. Until familiar rooms became cardboard boxes stacked near a garage door. Trust had become something I handled carefully, like fragile glass. Emily tugged my sleeve again, softer this time. "Please," she said quietly. "You should not be cold." Strange thing to hear from a child when most adults had stopped noticing. I looked toward William. He stood patiently, not pushing, not selling kindness, just waiting. His coat still dripped rainwater onto the diner floor, exhaustion sitting heavily across his face now that panic had begun to fade. He looked less like a wealthy stranger and more like a tired father trying to breathe again. "Only for tonight," I said finally. The relief on Emily's face arrived instantly. Bright, honest. She smiled in a way that made her look younger all at once. "Good," she whispered, like the decision mattered far more to her than it should have. William exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. "Thank you," he said, and something about the way he said it sounded sincere enough to unsettle me. Most people thanked me for small things over the years. Holding doors, bringing casseroles to funerals, watching neighbors' children for an afternoon. Nobody had sounded grateful simply because I allowed them to help me. Outside, the rain had softened slightly. The wind still pushed water sideways across the parking lot. One of the men near the entrance quietly stepped forward holding a large black umbrella while another opened the diner door. The waitress offered me a small paper bag with leftover bread rolls wrapped carefully in napkins. "For later," she said softly without making eye contact long enough to embarrass me. I thanked her quietly and slipped the bag into my tote. Hunger made people practical. Emily reached for my hand again before we stepped outside. Her fingers felt warm despite the cold night. The parking lot glistened beneath streetlights, puddles catching reflections of silver, clouds moving overhead. A dark SUV waited near the curb, polished enough to look unreal beside the tired city around it. One of the doors opened before we even reached it. Inside looked warmer than places I had slept in months. Soft leather seats, clean blankets folded neatly near the back, a faint smell of cedar and coffee lingering in the air. Emily climbed in first and immediately looked back at me expectantly. "Sit next to me," she said, patting the seat beside her like she had known me far longer than 3 hours. For reasons I could not explain, I did. The door shut softly behind me, and, for the first time in months, silence did not feel cold. Rain tapped lightly against the windows while warm air wrapped around me in a way so unfamiliar it almost made me uncomfortable. Emily settled beside me immediately, close enough that her shoulder touched mine, like the decision had already been made somewhere inside her that I belonged near her until morning. The car moved smoothly through wet Seattle streets, city lights stretching across the glass in long silver reflections. I caught myself staring at small things people stopped noticing when life felt steady. Heated seats, dry floor mats, bottled water tucked neatly into the door, a folded blanket resting beside Emily that probably existed because someone thought ahead about comfort. Funny what starts to look extraordinary after enough nights spent wondering whether shelter doors would still be open when you arrived. Emily leaned against me sleepily after only a few blocks. "You smell like rain," she mumbled softly, already half asleep. I almost laughed. That does not sound very nice. Her eyes stayed closed. No, she whispered, smiling faintly. Like outside after summer. William glanced at us briefly through the rearview mirror, something softer settling across his face before he looked away again. For several minutes, nobody said much. Just windshield wipers moving steadily back and forth while thunder drifted farther into the distance. Eventually, William cleared his throat. Emily usually does not trust people quickly, he said quietly. Neither do I answered before thinking. He nodded once, like he understood more than I intended to say. Then I suppose tonight surprised both of us. Outside, familiar streets gave way to neighborhoods I had not visited in years. Wider sidewalks, clean storefronts, homes with warm porch lights glowing against the storm. Places where people probably complained about late deliveries and noisy neighbors without realizing how fortunate ordinary problems could be. Hunger changed perspective. So did loneliness. Do you have family nearby? William asked carefully after a while, polite enough to sound optional rather than intrusive. I watched raindrops race each other down the window. A son, I answered. Daniel. The name felt heavier spoken aloud than expected. We are not close these days. William did not press. I appreciated that. Silence can feel respectful when someone earns it. Emily stirred beside me suddenly. Families are supposed to stay, she said sleepily, words soft with exhaustion. Nobody answered for a second. Children often told the truth without realizing adults had complicated it. William adjusted his grip on the steering wheel. Sometimes adults make mistakes, he said finally. Emily frowned with her eyes still closed. Big mistakes, she murmured. I looked out the window before answering quietly. Sometimes. We turned down a long, private drive lined with cedar trees glistening beneath yellow lights, and something tightened unexpectedly inside me. Not fear exactly. Memory. Wolf had once looked familiar. Before hospital bills. Before grief hollowed rooms out. Before signatures changed everything. Ahead, warm lights stretched across the outline of a large home sitting quietly against the dark sky, steady and welcoming in a way that made exhaustion suddenly feel very close. The house stood quietly at the end of the drive, lights glowing warm against the storm like something from another life. Not flashy, not loud, just steady. The kind of place that made people lower their voices without realizing it. One of the men opened the car door before I could reach for the handle, but Emily was already awake enough to tug gently at my sleeve. Come on, she said softly, excitement slipping into her tired voice. I want to show you my kitchen. Funny thing about children. They trusted ordinary things first. Kitchens, blankets, warm drinks. Not money, not titles. William walked a few steps behind us as rain softened into mist around the porch lights. I hesitated near the front door, suddenly aware of everything about myself. Damp coat, worn shoes carrying traces of sheltered dust, and city sidewalks. Hair flattened by weather. Exhaustion sitting visibly across my shoulders. There had been a time when stepping into homes like this felt normal. Dinner parties, Christmas mornings, neighbors bringing wine no one ever finished. Then grief arrived and life narrowed until survival became its own quiet occupation. Inside, warmth settled over me immediately. Real warmth. Not diner heat or shelter air struggling against winter. The house smelled faintly of cedar wood, laundry soap, and something sweet still lingering from dinner. Fresh bread maybe. Somewhere deeper inside, a clock ticked softly. Lamps glowed low across polished wood floors. Family photographs lined shelves without trying too hard to impress anyone. Emily dropped her shoes near the doorway without ceremony and turned back toward me. See, she said proudly, arms stretched wide. It feels safe. Safe. Such a simple word. Such an expensive thing to lose. William stepped toward a nearby hallway and returned carrying a folded sweater and thick wool socks. These should be more comfortable while your things dry, he said, careful enough to sound like an offer instead of pity. My sister left clothes here once during Christmas. I accepted them quietly, fingers brushing soft fabric that smelled faintly of clean linen. Thank you, I said, and meant it more than expected. Emily had already disappeared briefly before returning carrying a blanket nearly as large as herself. For the couch, she announced proudly, pressing it toward me. It is the soft one. William rubbed a tired hand across his face, something close to amusement breaking through the strain of the night. You are very determined, he told her. She stayed with me. Emily replied simply, like that explained everything. Maybe it did. A woman entered quietly from another room then, silver-haired and warm-eyed, probably near my age, dressed in a cardigan and slippers. Concern crossed her face before recognition softened it. Emily, she breathed, stepping forward immediately. Emily hugged her quickly. Grandma Ruth, this is Margaret. She saved me. The woman turned toward me then, eyes moving once over my tired appearance before settling somewhere kind and steady. No judgment. No questions sharpened by curiosity. Just recognition of fatigue. Another woman understood. Well, she said softly after a moment. Anyone who protected our girl tonight belongs at the table before they belong anywhere else. You must be starving. And somehow, standing there beneath warm lights while rain tapped quietly against distant windows, I realized nobody had spoken to me like I mattered in a very long time. The kitchen felt alive in the quiet way homes only do after midnight. Warm lights spilled across wide counters while rain whispered softly against distant windows, no longer angry, only lingering. Ruth moved around with the confidence of someone who had spent years feeding people through heartbreak, celebrations, and ordinary Thursdays that somehow still needed soup. Before I could protest, a bowl of steaming chicken stew sat in front of me, beside fresh bread still, warm enough to soften butter. Emily climbed onto the chair beside mine in oversized pajamas, her damp hair brushed neatly now, sleep pulling gently at her eyes while she fought to stay awake. You have to eat, she said with surprising seriousness. Grandma says food helps sad feelings think better. Ruth laughed softly from the stove. I may have said something close to that. I wrapped my hands around the bowl for a moment before lifting the spoon. Warmth spread slowly through me, unfamiliar enough that my chest tightened unexpectedly. Funny how hunger sneaks into a person. First the stomach, then the thoughts. Eventually, even hope starts shrinking to fit smaller spaces. William leaned quietly against the kitchen doorway, jacket gone now, sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms like exhaustion had finally convinced him to stop pretending he still controlled the evening. He looked different under warm light, less distant, more human, tired in the honest way grief and responsibility made people tired. Emily told my mother what happened, he said carefully after a while. And I wanted to thank you again. I shook my head lightly. You already did. He hesitated before sitting across from me. No, he said quietly. I do not think I did. Something in his tone made me glance up. Gratitude sat there. Yes, but something else too. Curiosity maybe. Concern. Emily trusts very few people, Ruth added gently while setting tea near me. Especially after her mother passed. The room softened around those words. Emily looked down at the table and traced small circles against the wood with sleepy fingers. William's face shifted almost imperceptibly, grief arriving and leaving in the same breath. She was 7, he said quietly. Since then, she holds on tightly to people who make her feel safe. Emily reached for my sleeve again, without looking up, like proof. I swallowed carefully around unexpected emotion. She is a brave girl, I said softly. Emily yawned immediately after as if bravery had worn her out. Ruth smiled knowingly. Bedtime. Emily frowned dramatically before turning toward me. Will you still be here tomorrow? The question arrived so quietly it almost hurt. Children asked for certainty the way adults secretly wanted to. I looked toward William, then back to her hopeful face. If your father still thinks it is all right, I said gently, I can stay long enough for breakfast. Relief spread across her features instantly. Pancakes, she whispered, deciding for everyone. Ruth laughed again, while William looked down briefly, shaking his head like something inside him had softened against his permission. Later, as I stood alone for a moment near the kitchen window watching rain slide down dark glass, warm tea resting between tired hands, I realized something strange. For the first time in months, tomorrow felt possible.